Hate the sound of my voice and all the endless blah, blah, blah? Go to eatsempire.com/recipes to learn how to make all these dishes without having to hear me say another word. Welcome, loyal and hungry denizens of the Eats Empire, to another Epicurean podcast. Who doesn't love a big bowl of piping hot beef stew spiked with fresh herbs and served with warm homemade dinner rolls slathered in butter? I'm guessing maybe cows and vegans and children are usually picky about food that's not in nugget form, but by and large, most cultures serve some form of this hearty dish, and in this episode of Eats Empire, I'm going to tell you one of the many ways I approach this culinary concoction of bovine divinity. I'll be using a 12-quart enamel-coated pot. You can use, of course, a crock pot, Dutch oven, stock pot, or whatever your largest vessel may be. I chose my 12-quart pot because I can never fit all the ingredients I want to use in my stew when I'm using a 6-quart crock pot. If you're using a smaller pot, adjust your ingredients accordingly. Before we begin, I want to mention that I will be using a variety of fresh and canned ingredients depending on what fresh or canned ingredients I have available. You'll notice near the end of this episode that I am using canned mushrooms. If you want to use fresh mushrooms, I would cook them separately and add them to the individual bowls of stew right before serving. If, like me, you will be freezing much of your stew for future consumption, I would use canned mushrooms, as the processing of canned mushrooms make them hold up much better when frozen as opposed to fresh mushrooms. I want to bring up a few more things before getting started. Some salt is introduced via the canned goods I will be using, but otherwise I add no salt during the preparation of this dish. Right before serving, I stir in about a teaspoon of oyster sauce in each bowl, which adds a bit of sodium and a nice umami to the flavor. You can use hoisin or hot sauce if you'd like, but I avoid adding any salt while cooking because I believe individuals should choose their own sodium and spice levels based on their tastes. When it comes to using canned broth or homemade stock, I prefer to use my homemade stock, but it's hard for me to make enough to keep up with the meals I prepare, so I will use low-sodium canned or carton broth as a substitute or to supplement my homemade stock. Want to learn how to make your own vegetable broth or bone stock? Go to eatsempire.com and click on the Recipes tab. I mostly stay away from bouillon cubes and granular bouillon because these products are very high in sodium. There is one bouillon product I keep in my cupboard to add more liquid to my stew in a pinch, and that's Herbach's sodium-free bouillon. Weiler's has a sodium-free bouillon as well, and they're about the same. I just tend to find Herbach's a little more readily available at the supermarkets I go to. For a quart of broth, I use 2 packets of chicken and 2 packets of beef mixed in with a quart of water. If you bought the Herbach's bouillon in jars, then 1 teaspoon equals 1 packet. So 4 teaspoons make a quart of sodium-free broth. The last issue I'd like to address concerns flour dredging and meat searing. Although dredging the beef in flour and searing it adds a nice consistency to the final dish, it's very messy. Also, I love to serve stew with homemade bread. So if your stew is thickened with flour and you're eating homemade bread, you end up shoveling in quite a bit of flour with every bite of your meal. I started using refried beans to thicken the sauce instead of flour. While a flour-thickened stew is nice, I've come to prefer the less glutinous consistency of stew that is thickened with refried beans. And I've discovered that if you do skip the flour dredging, searing the meat is just an unnecessary extra step that is easily avoided without detracting from the wonderfulness of your stew. Now let's get started. I want to let all the podcast listeners out there to know that if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, you are missing out on some truly incredible photos and video clips. If you'd like to see the video that goes along with this audio, you can go to eatsempire.com for podcast links, recipes, and other effluvia. You can also see the definition of effluvia. Here we go. Add the entire contents of a 28-ounce can of diced tomatoes to your pot. If you have a can of whole tomatoes, just squeeze and tear them into chunks. Hold the tomatoes down in your pot as they will shoot tomato juice and seeds all over the place. Next, you'll place a 4 to 5 pound chuck roast over the tomatoes. The reason we're not cutting the chuck roast into cubes first is that it's just a pain to saw through all that cartilage and gristle and meat when it's raw. So, just toss it in whole, cover, and simmer on low heat for 3 hours. Or 4 hours, or 5, doesn't matter. You just want to cook it through until it's well done for a minimum of 3 hours. Then, remove the beef and set it in a colander over a roasting pan or platter so you can retain any juices to add back to your stew. Now, while the roast cools down a bit, we'll add some more liquid to the stew. Add a big cup of coffee and a quart of stock or broth. Then, we'll add a whole peeled and cubed potato. You can use any type of potato you desire. I will be using a sweet potato as I have a can of white potatoes I'll be adding later. Next, add a can of beans. Dealer's choice. I'll be using garbanzo beans for this batch, but you can add whatever you have on hand. Pinto, kidney, cannellini, lima, whatever your choice, add the beans with the liquid to your stew. And I know I mentioned I mostly stay away from dried spices and seasonings, but I do like bay leaves, fresh or dried. So add 2 or 3 bay leaves, cover, and simmer for another hour. One thing I should have mentioned earlier is that during this entire process, you need to be adjusting your heat to keep your stew at a low simmer. Usually it means adjusting the heat slightly upwards as you add more ingredients, but if you hear or see your stew at a rapid boil, turn it down a bit. It just needs to be kept at a low simmer throughout the cooking phase. So during the last hour, while your potato was simmering, you should have been cutting your meat into bite-sized cubes. I do little to no trimming of the fat and grizzle, as the fat adds flavor and the grizzle adds cartilaginous goodness. If that stuff grosses you out, trim away. Now, dump in your cubey beef and add 2 ribs of chopped celery, 1 chopped up medium-sized white or yellow onion, and the same amount of chopped carrot that equals the amount of chopped celery. Also, add 2 or 3 cloves of chopped garlic, cover, and simmer for another hour. Now, if you can buy fresh corn, slice up 4 ears of corn into about 1-inch slices. I cannot emphasize this next direction enough. Be very careful when slicing cobs of corn. You will be tempted to curl your fingers underneath the blade for leverage. Do not do this. It will end badly. If you're not confident in your knife skills, please skip this step. Now, add a can of refried beans. You can use a spoon or spatula to get the beans out and add them directly to the stew, but then you'll have to stir around to chase down blobs of beans to mix them into your stew. I find it easier to scoop the refried beans into a big bowl and ladle in some hot broth from your stew and then stir them up to get a smooth, less viscous consistency before adding them back to your stew. Now, cover your stew and let it simmer for 30 minutes. The cooking phase is done. You done did good. Turn off the heat and we'll add more canned goods, stock, and refried beans until this 12-quart pot is filled to the top and has the right consistency. We're adding these canned goods at the end because they're already cooked and need no further cooking. I know we added the beans earlier and it's true they are already cooked, but I've found through trial and error that canned beans do benefit from being in the stew longer than the ingredients we're adding now. Another thing to keep in mind, we'll be adding the entire contents of these cans, including the liquid, to our stew. First, we'll add 2 small 4-ounce cans of mushrooms, then add an 8-ounce can of asparagus tips, and a 14-ounce can of sliced potatoes. I found that some canned items crap up the flavor for me, and those include canned spinach, green beans, peas, and corn. If you want to add these items instead of the ones I suggested, feel free, but you won't find those canned goods in my stew. But if you like greens in your stew, canned mustard greens are a nice addition and they don't give off the rankness that comes from using canned spinach. The last step is to gauge about how much room you have left in your pot and if it has the right consistency. If needed, use more stock or broth mixed with another can of refried beans to add more volume and depth to your stew. Your pot should now be all the way full. Let your stew continue to cool until it's a safer temperature to start transferring the contents to storage containers. Let's talk briefly about storage. I'm sure everyone knows how to store food in the refrigerator or freezer, but when you are making 12 quarts of soup or stew, it's best to plan ahead and be prepared. Use whatever containers you desire to store your stew. I use canning jars for freezing. I know that if I fill a 12-quart pot, then I need 12 quart jars to store it all. Another reason to use quart canning jars is that it just looks better than using an old margarine tub when you share your stew with family, friends, and neighbors. 3 important things to remember if you use canning jars to freeze your stew. First, don't tighten the lids down with rings while it's freezing, or the jars will burst open from the pressure. Allow the stew to completely freeze before you tighten the lids down with rings. Second, canning jars break easy when they bang into other jars when they are frozen. That's why it's not recommended you use them for freezer storage. But I'm a nonconformist rebel when it comes to food storage. If you do end up cracking a frozen jar of stew, luckily it's easy to clean up, but you don't want to lose a quart of stew because you cracked a jar while recklessly digging through your freezer, searching for your rent stash, and the last Klondike bar, or the finger you're icing after you cut it off from cutting up corn cobs. If you have the freezer space, you can place the jars back in the box they came in, or you can cut pieces of cardboard or bubble wrap to place between the jars, or you can just be cautious. The third thing to remember is, after freezing, let your stew fully defrost before you transfer the stew to a pot for reheating on the stove or to a microwave-safe dish for reheating in your microwave. And if you share your stew, make sure to tell your recipients the same thing. Do not attempt to use a microwave to defrost or heat your stew in the canning jar. Follow these 3 rules and you'll be fine. When using canning jars for storage, you'll need the stew to cool before filling your jars. It doesn't have to be cold, it's just easier and safer to transfer the stew to jars if it's not piping hot. If you decide to use canning jars, I'd recommend you buy a canning jar funnel. You can buy them wherever canning supplies are sold or on eBay or Amazon. They start at about $4 or $5 each and go up to about $25 each for the vintage glass varieties. And if you're stumped trying to figure out what to get me for Christmas, a vintage glass canning funnel is all I really want. Another consideration is going to an auto parts store and buying a funnel with a wide opening at the bottom. As long as you haven't used the funnel for changing your oil or transmission fluid, you'll be fine. When I'm ladling the stew into jars, I like to add about half a cup of frozen peas per quart. Frozen peas are great because they haven't been processed to death by commercial canning, and as long as you don't overcook them, when warming up your stew, they are a nice final addition. You may have noticed that nowhere in this recipe did I add salt or anything peppery or spicy, and the only dried spice I used were a few bay leaves. So you may find the stew a bit bland when you sample it. The great thing about this preparation is you have many options to adapt your meal to individual tastes. I wait until right before serving to add fresh herbs like cilantro, basil, and chive, and of course cracked pepper. I make condiments like hot sauce, oyster sauce, Worcestershire, or hoisin available so individuals can add some final touches of their own. Personally, I enjoy stirring in about a teaspoon of oyster sauce in my bowl, which adds just enough salt to bring out the flavor of all the wonderful ingredients. You can substitute hoisin or Worcestershire sauce or anchovy paste. All these options do add sodium to an otherwise very low sodium meal. If you'd like to add a wonderful flavor profile that only adds a tiny, negligible amount of sodium, you can stir in a teaspoon of curry paste. It's a delicious way to enhance your stew. But although most every curry paste is low sodium, they tend to be a bit spicy. So if you have a picky eater who doesn't like spicy food, curry paste might not be the best option for them. My favorite way to enjoy this stew, or any stew or soup for that matter, is to top it with huge amounts of chopped cilantro. Then top your cilantro with chopped chive or green onion. It's also nice to add copious amounts of chopped basil if you have it. I like a little rosemary also, but the leaves are a little tough, so I just stir the stew up a bit when it's piping hot with a nice little fresh sprig. Another personal favorite serving suggestion is to add some chopped broccoli pieces that you buy in the frozen food section. Just add a couple large spoonfuls right in the middle. Ideally, you'll be serving freshly baked dinner rolls, but you should at the very least have some crackers to go with it. By now, you've heard me mention fresh baked homemade dinner rolls a few times during this podcast. So, you may have the impression that I'm a master baker. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not a master baker. I don't even know what master baking is. I can masquerade as a master baker by using a bread machine to make perfect dough every time. You can be a fake master baker too. Just go to eatsempire.com and click on the recipes tab.